George Clooney realized something was profoundly wrong at a fundraiser when the president crossed the room to him and greeted him as if he was meeting him for the first time. Thanks for coming. Clooney was shocked. And you will recall that George Clooney wrote the letter saying Mr. Biden should step aside. Now, if Clooney knows, that's Hollywood. That's Hollywood money. They don't, they're not risk takers. They shouldn't be anyway. A lot of people knew. They knew beforehand. They certainly knew after Clooney told that story. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius in Londinium, and Germanicus is here, and we have Roman matters to deal with that are in the 21st century and the 18th century. And these Roman matters are not surprising to us. We understand that our empire here in the 1st century AD is the foundation for the empire of the Americans in the 21st century AD. And that is an obvious fact. We don't need to prove it, but it is surprising how these echoes keep coming up even though we're not looking. We begin with the news of the week that the expectation was a negotiation in Constantinople, sometimes called Istanbul, between the principals, that would be NATO and the Russian Federation and its allies, Beijing, Tehran, Pyongyang, and the Americans leading NATO. That did not come through, although Mr. Rubio was annoyed that there was the possibility and it didn't happen. And Mr. Zelensky, a foil in this matter, proposed that he meet Vladimir Putin in Constantinople. Very odd. That would be punching down for Mr. Putin. He is the emperor of the Russian Federation. Mr. Zelensky represents what's left of Ukraine. But I turn this over to Germanicus because all of this is a very slow motion version of something Germanicus has already outlined. Russia wins. Ukraine deals with the remains of the state. NATO reorganizes. The U.S. may or may not withdraw. What we are waiting for now is a fact or not that the emperor in Washington, the new Rome, is going to converse with the emperor in Moscow, the old New Rome, and they're going to settle the dispute about Ukraine, Kiev, which is sometimes New Jerusalem, sometimes Old New Jerusalem. You understand, these are all symbols that matter over the 2,000 years between where we are in 91 AD on a spring night in Londinium and where the conversation takes place in the 21st century. Germanicus says, a very good evening to you. I mentioned you and I don't need to shop for these things. They just come to us. A meeting in Istanbul, Constantinople, and it did not happen. I'm not looking for the fault. I'm looking for what it is that is magical about that city that would have helped if they'd actually showed up. Good evening to you.
Good evening, guys. It's one of the great ironies that I don't think is much appreciated that insisting on changing Constantinople's name to Istanbul is indirectly an homage, again, to the Greco-Roman world and antiquity and to the idea of a great imperial city that is sort of the queen of cities. Because Istanbul is Greek, Istanbulis, it means to the city. And what is the city? Constantinople. And the need to invest yourself with a kind of, great historical authority by conducting symbolic ritual business there is irresistible to all parties. It's one thing, again, ironically, that they all share. Unfortunately, Mr. Zelensky tried to pull a stunt there. The idea of having some sort of summit negotiation with Mr. Putin was always foolish, but the Ukrainians kept the Russian delegation waiting there for hours and hours. And then the delegation was very forthright. And in fact, rather than being a trap for Russia, it turned into an opportunity where they had a podium, a stage in Constantinople, where they could again present Russia's terms for a settlement. not a ceasefire, not an armistice or a suspension of hostilities in any form, but a settlement, a true settlement. And they reiterated all of that. And then, of course, the U.S. comes out again with a 22-point plan. Again, 22 is a bit bigger than 14, which was Wilson's sacred number, but those 22 proposals do not address the key issues um, behind the war. And the only pathway to a settlement is at some point to accept the core elements of the Russian bottom line. And so I'm not sure really what will happen in a phone call, but a phone call will be important as yet another Tilsit meeting between the two emperors, and will offer an opportunity yet again for Mr. Putin to speak directly to Mr. Trump and tell him yet again exactly what the bottom line is for Russia. And it's very simple, but it's essential. And I can reiterate that now, but I think we all know what it is. The problem for Mr. Trump now, and again, we've talked about this several times, is that the longer he postpones finding some pathway to achieving a settlement with Russia, the more he runs the risk of this war becoming his war, and the more of a briar patch, tar baby, swamp, morass it becomes for him. And I don't think he can put that off too much longer. And it's also, for a third irony this evening, to mention that he will be, in all probability, saved by Mr. Putin, because the continuing unraveling of the Russian lines continues as we speak every day. And it is an unraveling that goes across the entire line of contact, as they call it, the entire front, the Ost front in in the East. And at some point, it's going to collapse. And at that point, it will be a great moment of truth, because at that point, there will be no alternative. So essentially, a Russian successful offensive offers Mr. Trump a timeline. And he's in a position where the sweet spot, to use that cliche, lies somewhere between the rejection by Russia of the 22-point American plan and the ultimate collapse of the Ukrainian situation on the battlefield, which would be a terrible, terrible blow, and probably the end of NATO right there. So something needs to be done in that space sooner, preferably from everyone's standpoint, rather than later. So I think these next several months will be key. Now, I think Mr. Trump, if he can reach an agreement with Iran, will gain stature from that, and that will give him authority and a higher standing with the American people, which will allow him to wait a little bit longer. But it will not give him sufficient stature to become bellicose with Russia, because that would tend to threaten escalation and war. And I think Mr. Trump has already learned a lesson, or perhaps just received a useful insight in terms of the limits of what the U.S. can do militarily with the mini adventure in Houthi land, where the U.S. Suffered more than the Houthi, and the Houthi essentially enabled Mr. Trump to claim a victory, while they, of course, also claimed a victory, which was more justly theirs. But nonetheless, they created a context where he could extricate. And I think he may have learned from that. And I think Mr. Putin is perfectly willing to do that, but only within the limits of the Russian bottom line. I keep saying bottom line because there is no possible way in which Russia will, after having lost over 100,000 dead in battle, is going to um, buy a temporary respite from hostilities so that Ukraine can rearm and they can go at it again somewhere down the line. I mean, not only is Mr. Putin tremendously sensitive to the issue of Russian casualties, but he is also tremendously sensitive to the fact that he has nearly the full support of the Russian people and a rather passionate support too. And I read reports from Russia. There is great unity now in Russia. And he has to fulfill, therefore, the expectations of the Russian people. Now, contrast that to the expectations of the American people, which are primarily get us out of this war, do not let it escalate. So the pathway for Mr. Trump is straightforward in terms of his strategic choices, or rather the space, the boundary space for those choices. But he does not have the option of upping sanctions and putting more quote unquote pressure on Mr. Putin. That would be self-defeating for him politically and for his future. And his future is winnowing in terms of the time he has to cement his historical contribution to humankind in the United States of America. So I think you're going to see a resolution, but it won't happen tomorrow morning.
Germanicus, a quick question. Just a minute. Constantinople is a magical name.
Yes.
That's the Eastern Empire of Rome. That is the foundation for what we're talking about. They continued the traditions of the Roman people until the conquest by the Ottomans. Naming that city as a place to negotiate, is it your sense that they were without irony when they did that, or did they understand what they were proposing?
The Ukrainians are I mean, by that I mean the Ukrainian regime has very little capacity for anything outside the compass of its narrow Banderite ideology. In other words, the current Ukrainian nationalism is the
Right.
creation of some wild, crazy people in the 1920s and after. So I'm not. They wanted the positive spin from being in Istanbul, which would tend to elevate Zelensky, but without Mr. Putin being there, there was very little option. In other words, so many of the gambits that Ukraine has pursued have failed, and some of them have failed disastrously, like the invasion in the Kursk region. So, to me, it's merely trying to buy time and to maintain his stature, but that's not possible. As you said, these figures, along with Starmer and Macron and whoever is in
Tusk
charge in Germany.
Tusk and
Pardon
Merz.
me.
Merz for
Yes, I
Germany
know.
and Tusk for Poland. Yes.
Yes, Tusk. Let's not forget Tusk. Tusk is probably has the greatest authority of all of them, but simply because he has a real military. But it's a situation that's unraveling for the Europeans and for Kiev, and that is not bad. It's not bad for Mr. Putin, but it's not bad for Mr. Trump, because he's laid the groundwork
Right.
for all of this. He's laid the groundwork for the U.S. stepping in and saying enough is enough. We're going to come to a settlement, not a ceasefire. And you fools have been, you
I didn't.
know,
I didn't hear a veto going to Kiev. Did you hear a veto?
a veto on who?
I didn't hear that Kiev has a veto. London has a veto. Paris has a.
Oh
I didn't.
no, no. But the failure here, you see,
They're standing back and let this conversation go forward. They're not. Whatever they say afterwards, they don't have a veto. Is my reading.
well, this was why I can't understand why Kiev risked this, because a foolish outcome, which is what Ukraine was able to achieve, only diminishes
Right.
whatever vestigial authority they have. So now, you see, both Kiev and Moscow are giving Mr. Trump extra maneuver room, extra
Right.
permission to come to a conclusion that we forge directly with Mr. Putin.
Let's go to the New Jerusalem, Washington, and America, because there's news from Tiberius's camp. The Julian Claudian emperors, beginning with Augustus, aka Octavian, did not have a retirement mechanism. However, the emperors were retired often violently. Augustus, we believe, died in his sleep. We believe that, though there are stories. Tiberius, we believe, died in his sleep, though there are stories that he was hurried along because he was taking too long. Caligula died violently. Claudius, the story is he was poisoned because he ate mushrooms. Maybe. It's a good story. And then Nero, very violently by his servant's hand. And then we moved into another version of reality, which was the Vespasian who achieved the empire after 3 men died violently before him. And then his son Titus, and then his son Domitian, our present emperor, whom we know will die violently. Titus probably died of natural consequences, but we can't be sure. You see, there's a pattern here. You don't retire in the 1st century AD, but in the 21st century, you do. However, Germanicus, I am a senior citizen. I have endured what it is to be told that you have cancer. It is not a good day in your life, but you make a decision afterwards. I'm going to stick around.
Mhm.
And we hear now from the Tiberian Biden camp that Mr. Biden has been diagnosed with cancer, prostate cancer. My cancer was not prostate, but I took the radiation with a number of men who were there for prostate cancer, the big machine at Mount Sinai, and talked to them often. It's something that is imminently survivable, and modern medicine is miraculous. However, it is cancer, so I don't belittle it. It changes everything about your decision making. And afterwards, you're not the same. You've crossed a line. You're a cancer survivor. You're no longer a person who believes it won't happen. Mr. Biden is now going through that. He's a few years older than I am, but I believe I can see myself at 81 or 82. And you take things very slowly. All of that I mention because I mean to be generous here. However, within 2 days, I was at the bookstore today. Within 2 days, a book called Original Sin will be available for purchase. My bookstore in Kent, Connecticut made it very clear to me that they've got a long line. They're going to be good to me and put me at the front of the line. And I said, you don't need to do that. But they said, fine, you buy too many books not to. However, everybody wants to read what they already know. And the book is going to tell people what they already knew. That Mr. Biden, for a goodly part of his term, was not up to the task of being the emperor of Rome or the president of the United States. What is to be done? Who has learned from this, Germanicus? I'm looking for you learn from cancer. Who's learning now from the fact that Mr. Biden was not adequate for the job, and hence Mr. Trump inherited several wars and enmity that was going to be several generations solving. What do we learn?
One of the differences between Americans and Romans, and you cited this difference, was the fact that the succession process in Rome often involved the end of the emperor's life, the former emperor's life, and while our emperors are retired. Another difference along with that is in Rome, the not the regular people, but the equus class and higher citizens did not have the opportunity that Americans have to see what was going on behind the veil. So they couldn't read Suetonius in the time of the emperors we just mentioned, the Julio-Claudian emperors. And today they can't. Today they see it comes out, and therefore in Rome, the process of delegitimating the former emperor and passing the authority to the new emperor, if there was a contested succession, meaning a small civil war, coup d'état, or an assassination, what they would do is, and we've mentioned this before, is they'd go through this ritual of damnatio imperio, where they'd take all the statues and faces of the emperor on legionary standards and cut them out and deface them, or cut off the marble heads, as it were. And instead of that, we use this access to information to create a different kind of ritual that has the same purpose and the same result, and that would be to create narratives that are in effect damnatio imperio, so that we'll never look at Mr. Biden again the way we would have before he was president, or even during his presidency, because many blue people admired him desperately during his time in office, and that will no longer be possible. And in effect, there is a cascade, a kind of rushing river of historical consequences that flow from this, and that is the damnatio imperio does not just extend to the person of the former emperor, but to his whole faction, his whole party. And that's hard to recover from, because the process of regaining authority has to start from, as it were, ground zero. It has to be rebuilt. The Republicans experienced this, for example, after the damnatio of imperio of Richard Nixon, and now it's the same for Democrats. And as a result, what we're seeing is a period where Republicans, the red people, may have a time of ascendancy, and that time of ascendancy is dangerous because it may lead to overextension, to pushing things too hard, in part because you believe that you have unassailable authority. That hasn't quite happened yet, but it certainly could.
Two points to make. The 25th Amendment permits a mechanism. It was not discussed for Mr. Biden. It was much discussed for Mr. Trump previously.
Yes.
So it was on the minds of people who were supporting Mr. Biden because they'd much talked of it when Mr. Trump was president. The vice president is a viable political candidate for the highest office. Viable, very viable, especially if the former vice president, follows the path of California governorship, which is available, and that stands at 28. Yes, fine. The vice president did not move, and we do not have an explanation. Second point, George Clooney. There is no bigger star. I don't need to go any further than that. George Clooney tells the story, and I've not read it myself. I've only read a summary of it because I don't have the book. I'm waiting for Tuesday. They won't send the books out till it's published. George Clooney realized something was profoundly wrong at a fundraiser when the president crossed the room to him and greeted him as if he was meeting him for the first time. Thanks for coming. Clooney was shocked. And you will recall that George Clooney wrote the letter saying Mr. Biden should step aside. Now, if Clooney knows, that's Hollywood. That's Hollywood money. They don't risk, they're not risk takers. They shouldn't be anyway. A lot of people knew. They knew beforehand. They certainly knew after Clooney told that story. And yet, silence. This book, we're told, and I do not have the book. I emphasize, I want to read the things I've been told because I've noticed there can be a problem between news summaries and the facts. I've read and been told that all of these interviews were conducted after the election. That's not good, Germanicus. That means that the cover-up continues.
Well, when the co-author of the book is one of the key perpetrators of the deception and purveyor of lies, then you know you're in trouble. And this is why I like your comparison with Tiberius, in large part because Tiberius, the latter half of his reign, he was frolicking in Capri. Now, Mr. Biden wasn't frolicking anywhere, I would imagine, but uh, Aelius Sejanus was the man who ran the empire, and then he had to be assassinated by the head of the Praetorian Guard, and that really created an instability in the entire Roman system, which wasn't really fixed for a while until Claudius came in. Then it wasn't really fixed until Vespasian, and that fell apart fairly quickly too. So, in many ways, the first century of Rome was very unstable. It wasn't until Antoninus, Nerva, and then Trajan, of course, that a viable constitutional order could be properly created. And and this is a situation that's different because the United States has been a stable constitutional order, and it's only been recently that it has begun to come apart. And its current instability is really quite real. And we've seen that in the last several elections. And it hasn't gone away simply because Red scored a victory with Mr. Trump.
No,
It,
not
it,
at all. Not at all, because I mentioned the vice president. The election is still underway. We're
that's right.
always looking to the next and the next. We always look to succession. The vice president
And
has questions to answer that I don't know whether the vice president will answer these questions, but it's part of the conversation. And Mr. Biden permitted that. But more to the point, no, the point. The Democrats chose Biden in 16 and 20. They chose him. He was last. He wasn't even going to stick around in New Hampshire for an exit interview. And then the decision was made, we've got to go with Biden, otherwise Bernie Sanders will get it. In other words, the choice of the people voting in the primary for the Democratic Party was Bernie Sanders. And the party fathers, is that what they're called? The party leadership
well,
weighed
that
in.
again that's a very Roman way of titling them. But that's why I brought up Tiberius and Sejanus and what followed, is that the instability today, that constitutional instability, is not between two warring parties alone; it's within the parties themselves. And at this point, the the Democrats, but it will be within the Republican Party um, once Mr. Trump passes from the scene. And what exists is a do or die situation where one party can't afford to give up power, and that's exactly what the Democrats faced in 2020. They were unwilling to give up power, and certainly had they nominated Mr. Sanders, they would probably have lost. And so they went a really devious and subversive route. Then the 2020 election was problematic, and it goes on and on, and I see an unraveling that is very slow, and it is not military in any sense, but it is legal. The legal battle is, there's a reason they call it lawfare. It is do or die,
all
and
those men
no
and
no
women,
mercy.
all those men and women at the White House who knew the facts, what were they telling themselves? All the From October 23, we've heard the Robert Hur interview in part because they're putting
But
it out now. We heard
this
that
is
October
yeah.
23, everybody would have known he was no longer capable of leading. That's all. It's a very high bar. And it was not possible after that. And
It's
yet,
really simple. I mean, I see it because I saw it. I've been in on the inside, and I could see it. This is the problem. This is why we have a constitutional order that is highly vulnerable and in danger, because this was the thinking. It doesn't matter who the Democrat is, the figurehead, the leader. It doesn't matter if he's even alive. Anything is better than yielding power, handing over powers. It's called. It's not really handing over power, but it's an electoral process. But
Where did they get the authority to make that decision? Who gave it to them? Who
it's
elected them to decide to deceive America?
it's religious in nature, and I think it has to do with the extreme sense. It's kind of a Calvinist Marxist way of looking at the world, where it's either or, good and evil, and we're the chosen ones. That's at the heart of Calvinist doctrine and theology, and the anointed are the anointed, and the other side, they may call themselves Christian, but they need to be destroyed. And this wasn't the nature of the republic between the end of Reconstruction, so say 1877, all the way up until very recently. And now we've reacquired that sense of either or, good and evil, within our nation, and that's not sustainable. I don't know how it gets resolved, and I don't know how or under what circumstances it moves into a conflict more bitter than the one we have now. But in terms of emotions, no conflict could be more bitter than the one we have now. Blue women won't date red men. It just won't do it. The gap among young people, men and women, uh, is unbelievable in terms of blue women versus red men. It's an unyielding situation, and the imposition of this wildly strife-ridden approach to humankind, in which you divide humanity into different groups, which are essentialist groups, that you are what you are because of A or B or C, and that's very superficial, like your skin color or so-called gender or so-called sexual preference. And that helps to cement and reinforce the battle lines. In other words, this is a process that we saw in Rwanda in the lead up to the massacres that occurred there in the 90s. You can see it in Spain in the period before the Spanish Civil War. Now, the U.S. is in many ways some fair distance from the kind of horrors of those two events, but we're not immune to it, and we're not immune because of the belief systems at war. They're religious belief systems.
Yeah.
No one will admit to that. No one will use that language, and that makes it even harder then to think about a resolution, because you won't even admit or open up and recognize the fact that this is a theological gulf of bitterness, anger, and hate that has been the basis for some of the most horrible events in human history.
Let's turn to a poet. Make us feel better. Before we go to Vergil, declaration by Vice President and Cabinet members of President's inability. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment. Whenever the Vice President and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall immediately assume the powers and duties of his office as acting President. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. Vergil the poet, 70 BCE to 19 BCE, the man of the American Revolution. Publius Vergilius Maro, born 70 BCE near Mantua, a poet, not a warrior, a man who spent his life pretty much on the farm. And he wrote 3 great works that were very well part of our education here in the first century AD, the eclogues, the Georgics, I'll pronounce it the American way, and the Aeneid, the story of a minor character in the Iliad who leaves the ruin of Troy and seeks a new land for himself and the people who fled the disaster of Troy. And they found Rome. That's the story of the Aeneid. However, I learned from a recent conversation with a professor retired from the University of Montana, his name is Rob Nadelson, that Vergil was the choice of our founding fathers. Not only that, if you all have a dollar bill these days, annuit coptis is on the reverse of the dollar bill near the Great Seal. Also, Novus Ordo Seclorum, also there on the other side. Both are quotes from Vergil. The first means God has approved our undertakings, meaning we're taking this risk. And the second is a new order of the ages. There's a remark on the front of the dollar bill that also is suggestive of Vergil, but that's enough. Germanicus, this is a joy to discover. I had no way of knowing until I read this article that with all these quotes, they're all over the place. They're not just the big speeches. They're letters to each other. Gouverneur Morris's letter, James Madison's letter, George Washington's letter. And in speaking to Professor Nadelson, I learned that that was their education. That was how they showed each other that they were educated men and were coming to these decisions, weighing them according to the ages. It's wonderful to discover, but at the same time, we didn't look for it. It's just there, kind of language that is sustaining the United States. And I wish that I'd known this in my education in the 20th century, and I could have carried it back to my education in the first century AD. How do you respond to the fact that Vergil is everywhere, although he was a modest man who wrote poetry? That's what he did. He wasn't ever looking to be a public man, public figure. He was extremely celebrated in his own time, but shy, very shy.
Vergil spoke compellingly to the founders, in the sense that the founders, being not only unified, but absolutely aware together that they were setting off in a fragile boat from the source, which was Britain, of who they were, and creating a new identity, and then proceeding eventually to found a new place not only far away across the oceans, a la the Atlantic, but in a wilderness land, of course, the wilderness empire that was North America. And it must be said that all peoples, once they achieve a kind of greatness, must also create for themselves an origin narrative, a heroic story that both presages and helps to fulfill the eventual destiny of that people to greatness. In other words, the greatness had to mean something. It had to come from somewhere. And typically, in fact, almost always, that somewhere takes the form of a single person, a great hero, who has, for whatever reasons, fled from the origin, which was also great. So the sense here with Troy is that however Troy came to fight Greece, they were part of the same world, the same known world, or ecumene. And surviving the fall of Troy, Aeneas sets out on a perilous journey eventually to set the stage for the founding of Rome. And Rome, of course, would eclipse Greece. That was part of the message, that Rome would eclipse the place from whence it came, which it did, that the U.S. would eclipse the place from whence it came, which was Britain, and America eclipses Britannia. Well, that happened. And Britain became a kind of sidekick to the U.S., where we admire its culture and love to watch uh, Downton Abbey and celebrate its own history, and yet we, at the same time, condescend toward them as well. Romans did the same thing with the Greeks, and therefore, this kind of self awareness is remarkable, but it's also something that is so deeply rooted that it was easy to come to, and they all celebrated it together. And the Great Seal, therefore, a new order of the ages, is the whole point of the narrative, because what the narrative is saying is, oh, we were great, but we were always great. We were always destined to become what we are now. And here's the story that authorizes that absolutely legitimates our right to be favored by the divine.
Agriculture. We easily forget that we're built on the success of our farmers.
And who is the great farmer? Washington.
Yes, yes. Virgil reminded me of that. Shy, but all the metaphors, they're all agrarian metaphors, not war
Yes.
metaphors.
Well,
A detail about Virgil. There's a debate
yes,
whether to
please.
spell it VE or VI. Do you have a choice, Germanicus?
No, I'm so happy you brought up the agricolorum, the whole thing. The farm, the soil, the fertility of the soil is a metaphor for the fertility, the bounty, the promise of the people and where they are. It binds the people to the land. And of course, the Roman pastoral poetry and the farm was so critical to the Republic. I mean, even when you look at great heroes of the Republic like King Conatus, he put down his plow to fight for the Republic as a senior citizen. So I just think that Virgil was really tying everything together. And if I could just add one more thing that takes it into the next step before you get to the inheritance of the United States, and that is when the Western Empire came apart, all of the new rulers, the new Germanic people who wanted above all to be Roman, they would hire Romans to write their own Aeneid, and they would hire Roman men of law to put together an ancestral tree that would always go back to who? To Aeneas. So you would see the Lombards, the Franks, the Visigoths all had a tree that went back to Aeneas.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. We're in Londinium. And it's important to us to mention the poetry of the first century BCE dominated our era. I believe that it slipped away a little bit, but America has it to discover on your dollar bill. Just turn over the dollar bill and you can see two quotes from Virgil. He's that modern.
Arma virumque cano.
Michael Vlahos, John Batchelor, thank you.